they can also be an opportunity to reconnect with the inspiration that led to important developments. And that surely is the case with the establishment of the Irish School of Ecumenics. The vision of Michael Hurley was for something which would be new and creative and transformative, that it would marry the best traditions of the denominations on the island, the scholarship of those committed to academe, and the engagement of concerned citizens, believers and otherwise, in the search for peace, reconciliation, and the good of the whole created earth. And surely that's a program which is as relevant to our day as it was 50 years ago. The journey of ISE over those 50 years has been a short one in terms of physical distance from Dublin 6 to Dublin 2, but it has also embraced much of the island and beyond through the reach of its alumni and the scholars who have developed with us and have moved elsewhere. It has made its contribution in the area of theology, peace studies, and civic engagement. It's provided inspiration and hopefully nurturing, and it continues to do that. It has been a journey of some satisfaction to see the school located within Trinity College, now an integral part, a distinct but integral part of the School of Religion, which holds much promise for exciting contributions in Ireland and well beyond. So it is an anniversary worth marking and indeed celebrating. This series of webinars is one of the program events which is made possible by the availability of Jin to act as coordinator, animator, and driver of this series of webinars, about which I'm sure he'll tell us more later on. And the Trust has been delighted to support his work in that role. We've also supported the development of a program of encounter under the title, Is There a Common Good?, which is beginning primarily within Northern Ireland and the border counties, and which is based on a model of community engagement. So both the academic and scholarship tradition and the community engagement tradition of ISE are being honored in the program. And it is perhaps an unintended, but nonetheless striking coincidence that the ecumenical spirit is honored even in the setting of this webinar, because after all, we're celebrating a primarily Jesuit initiative on the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. And can there be a more ecumenical encounter than that? So I hope we will have a most stimulating and engaging evening through this webinar, and that the participation in it will whet your appetite for more over the months ahead. So again, with thanks to Jin, I invite Siobhán to address us on behalf of the School of Religion.
Thank you very much, Dermot. It is a real honour to have the opportunity to welcome you this evening, and in particular to say congratulations to the Irish School of Ecumenics. Courageous, 50 years is a remarkable achievement, and a remarkable amount of good has been done by the ISE in those 50 years. I love that the ISE is taking a year to celebrate. I can relate to that. And as a sort of a parade of events that really usher in a new decade and consolidate the decades that have gone. And I relate to it as an academic who really values the work of institutions like the ISE, but also as somebody who happens also to be the same age as the ISE. And it's quite nice to have a parade of events in an otherwise in a year in which it is otherwise quite difficult to have celebrations in the normal way. In those 50 years, I became aware of the ISE long before I became aware of Trinity, and it informed my theological landscape. Growing up in Liverpool, privileged to be part of a lot of ecumenical work there. It informed my theological landscape long before Trinity College did. And I'm now very, very pleased to be in an institution, a nexus, where both organisations are closely working together. The ISE has changed the landscape of religious self-understanding in Ireland and beyond, and it has changed in many, many ways. I think it's the diversity of its reach that is so much to be congratulated. But it's changed the landscape of mutual understanding in the island and beyond. And its witness is born in many, many, many places, as you know. And so congratulations for that reach and that work. And especially wearing the hat that I'm wearing this evening, especially for persevering with the changing landscape of academic engagement these last 50 years, and of taking a leadership role in shaping academic engagement in theology and in associated disciplines, which is so important for the work of ecumenism. As Hans Kung put it, to be a real Christian is to be an ecumenical Christian, because unity is the essence of the church. But unity is also what gives academic endeavours their strength. And so it's not just that we congratulate your presence in the academic sphere with the integrity and strength that it has. It's also that we thank you for the vision of unity that your expertise and dedication and witness brings to the academic enterprise. So I look forward immensely to the art of ecumenics informing the School of Religion in the future. It's a future in which we need the Irish School of Ecumenics and its diverse works and its diverse peoples. And it is a privilege to be able to work so closely alongside you. Thank you to Jin for organising it, to all our leaders for leading us, and to all of you for participating. And I'll pass back to Jin at this point.
Thank you very much, Siobhán. Now, the roundtable panel discussion will begin. The panel discussion will be chaired by Professor Geraldine Smyth.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, and you're each and all very, very welcome. It's wonderful to be able to see snapshots of former students and staff, of associates and people who've collaborated with us over the years. And we are delighted that there's been such a wonderful response to the invitation. The art of ecumenics was mentioned by Siobhán, and the image I'm holding going into this webinar is that beautiful painting of Paul Henry, the launching of the Curragh. As you know, the boat is the international ecumenical symbol, and I have above my fireplace in my room here the Paul Henry painting. So I'm holding that, and I'm also holding in front of me the service of remembrance and thanksgiving for Michael Hurley 10 years ago this year. And there are 3 words on the front cover. It was a service of remembrance, of thanksgiving for Michael Hurley and his work. And the worship theme at the bottom was hoping against hope. So that in a way encapsulates my thoughts and my hopes for this event, as for all the events of ISE at 50, which this evening's webinar in a sense launches. We have a wonderful lineup of contributors, and the format of the webinar will be in 3 rounds. The 5 invited speakers will each speak in each round for 5 to 7 minutes on a question that they have been asked to consider beforehand. And then the 3rd round will be an opportunity for plenary questioning and discussion with the panel. And then a brief conclusion. We hope to be fully wound up by 7 o'clock. So the question that each panelist will address in this first round is to offer their, well, it's really to offer their reflections, their comments, their views on the historical and contemporary ecumenical movement for reconciliation. And they'll focus their contribution from the perspective of their own work, the relationship with their own work, what they've observed, what they've lived through, what they've experienced, and what they foresee. So our first speaker is Professor Linda Hogan. And Linda is Professor of Ecumenics in ISE in the School of Religion in Trinity College. She was formerly head of ISE, followed by a stellar 5-year term as Vice Provost of Trinity. Linda is an internationally known and widely published scholar practitioner in the interdisciplinary field of ethics, gender, human rights, the role of religion and politics. She has led major global and international research projects. Most apposite to our theme this evening was possibly ISE's pioneering research on visioning ecumenism for the 21st century, in which Linda was the principal investigator. Amongst her recent publications are Keeping Faith with Human Rights, 2015, and a jointly edited collection on feminist Catholic theological ethics, Conversations in the World Church, 2014. Linda's also been a member of many distinguished and important panels in civic and public life. For example, the Irish Council for Bioethics, a member of the board of the Croom Hospital, Science Gallery, and Marino Institute of Education. Linda, from this multifaceted store of life wisdom, what will you open up for us in the next 5 to 7 minutes?
Thank you, Geraldine, for that introduction and the invitation to open this conversation. Before I do, though, I also want to really express my gratitude to the Irish School of Ecumenics trust in its totality over the 5 decades, because that really has been the anchor of this work. It's had many forms and expressions and many people involved, but at core, it's been a community committed to ecumenics in a broad sense. And what I want to reflect on this evening very briefly is really from my perspective, I suppose, as an ethicist who's interested in contemporary questions of politics and really thinking about what the contributions and challenges of ecumenics are to our current state, the state we find ourselves. Just begin with a very brief comment from an essay by Marilyn Robinson in the New York Review of Books in June. The essay was called "What Kind of Country Do We Want?" and it was about the United States. But in considering some of the uniquely American features of the crisis in which we find ourselves, she asks a fundamental question. She says, the coronavirus has the potential for mitigation, for treatment, and ultimately for prevention, but the decline in hope and purpose is a crisis of civilization. And she asks, what's the basis of this crisis of civilization? And she says that we have lost the ethical restraint and respect for distinctiveness of cultures. And so these have fallen away in eager deference to profitability. But in line with the question about hope that was just raised a moment ago, She asks, now that the imaginary walls have fallen away in a way because of the coronavirus, we can consider what kind of habitation, what kind of home we want. So I suppose I'm reflecting on what kind of home do we want, and do we have the capacity to forge a future based on a reverent appreciation of humankind and a commitment to planetary well-being, because this is, in a way, in essence, the essence of ecumenics. And what kind of moral leadership does the Ecumenical Movement for Reconciliation give in that? And as I've been thinking about this question of what kind of leadership is given, and in terms of particularly the contribution, I think it falls into a number of different categories. It's about critique and denunciation. It's about an invitation to a new kind of understanding. And it's also a call to bold action. And these are, in a way, the contributions that ecumenics can make. We see these contributions in so many different fields. The movement for reconciliation has really focused on issues of the climate emergency, responses to the assault on democracy, responses, very importantly, and we have this in our own school, the response to the violence perpetrated against minorities and vulnerable populations. We see that with the work that Jude Lal Fernando, for example, does. We do this work, and I think the work of ecumenics is done not only through the academic work, but also through the advocacy and the praxis that is sort of central to the movement for reconciliation. And I think one of the most important features of this has been the way in which it has evolved from a mostly denominationally based responses through to ecumenical responses to interfaith responses. And, you know, we saw a wonderful interfaith response to I suppose, degradation of religious symbols to shore up a particular version of religious populism last summer when the faith leaders in the United States denounced the way in which President Trump used the Bible as a symbol for, for political purposes and as a way to reinforce values that are, to shore up racism and systemic violence and support for that.
Jen, has Linda frozen?
Yeah.
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 I think we've lost her, Geraldine.
Yes. So I think maybe, can you communicate with her, Jen, to say that we move on?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Some time at the beginning of her second round to make good the time she is.
That would be great. Thank you, Geraldine.
I hope that doesn't precipitate you without warning, Salters. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Salter Sterling. Salters hails from Belfast. He's an alumnus of Magee University College in Derry, Londonderry, Trinity College Dublin, and Queen's Belfast. Dr. Sterling is a member of the steering committee of the Irish School of Ecumenics Trust and a former chairperson. He's an elder statesman, or maybe he prefers sage, in the ecumenical movement. Salters has held key positions since 1961 to the present day in the student Christian movement and in fields of higher education, whether researching or pioneering policy change across these islands. He's been variously a delegate, a convener, an advisor to the World Student Christian Federation. Many here know him as an intrepid ecumenical educator and ambassador globally. and across these islands in fields of reconciliation, formerly as chair of the Dublin Council of Churches, in academic administrative roles in Trinity, as administrator of the very significant work of the Anglo-Irish Encounter Conferences. And he has journeyed with the Irish School of Ecumenics right down these 50 years. We can anticipate from you, Salters, ecumenical depth and perspective from one who grew up in the Presbyterian tradition of worship and practice, tinged with the Catholic, and now worshipping within the Anglican tradition. One who thinks boundaries are made for crossing, stretching. I'll stop there. Salters.
Thank you, Geraldine. It's as well you stopped there. I might have gone home, so to speak. It's an embarrassing introduction. I thank you very much for it. And I want to thank Jin for the organizing of these seminars and for the invitation to me to contribute. I think it's a wonderful occasion for the Irish School of Ecumenics to be able to celebrate 50 continuous years of contribution. Looking at those of you who are my companions in this webinar, I wondered what my contribution should be. And I decided to have 3 points to make within the 7 minutes. And the first of those is to take us all back, including myself, to January 1913, when 275 students and 50 senior friends gathered in Belfast for a conference that should have taken place in Dublin, called Ireland's Hope. There's that word again. And it was in Belfast because the organizers of the conference, William Garrigan and Tom Barker, both of them young Presbyterian ministers, decided that what had happened over the Ulster Covenant needed some kind of a response that was not direct, but sufficiently oblique as to send a signal. The conference was itself one of a pattern that had been established in 1895, growing out of the Student Volunteer Missionary Union, with a tremendous background of missionary service. It continued either every 2 years or sometimes with only a year intervening, up until 1910, with the Edinburgh Conference. Both of those men, Garrigan and Barker, were at that Edinburgh Conference, the missionary conference. And they decided, in the light of what had happened earlier in 1912, that the conference should be in Belfast. Let me share with you the agenda. The call to study the Irish present, individual responsibility, ancient Ireland, capital and labor, immigration, the pathology of intemperance, the housing of the poor, pauperism, education and citizenship, some modern Irish movements, political suspicions, religious intolerance, Ireland's hope, the field is the world. That conference began the ecumenical movement in Ireland, I say without any kind of contradiction. Of course, it was entirely Protestant, but it was broadly Protestant in the sense that the division between those who are fundamentalist Christians and those who are not fundamentalist Christians had not occurred as far as Ireland was concerned. There was the beginnings of it from about 1907 in Britain, but not in Ireland, not until 1916. And so the shape of ecumenism in Ireland was determined by that agenda. And it was many of the people who attended that conference, either as seniors or as students, who went on to be part of the Irish Council of Churches, and its first appearance, of course, had a different title from 1922-23 onwards. Now, that's one of the items that I want to put before you in order to say things in the second round. The second item I want to put before you is when I joined in 1952. When I say joined, this is the starting point of my engagement with things ecumenical. And it was a conference in Enniskillen, on the occasion of which the headmaster of Portora introduced the significant elements from the conference in Lund that had happened earlier in the year, and in which the Great Lund Principle was the most focusing element for him. And he shared that with us, in which the Lund Faith and Order Conference invited the churches to ask themselves whether they are showing sufficient eagerness to enter into conversations with other churches, and whether they should not act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately. That was a very liberating experience, not just for me, but for many of those who attended, maybe all of them, in fact, because it said to us, not just as institutions, but as individuals, we had the opportunity, the right, the authority within conscience to do together what had to be done ecumenically. It had an extraordinary effect. And that effect began to work itself out on the third point I want to make in the 7 minutes. And that is to talk about the consequences of the publication of a book called The Northern Ireland Problem by Dennis P. Barrett and Charles F. Carter, a book that seems to almost have disappeared over the horizon of ecumenical thinking. Indeed, a great deal of the discourse about Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland, because that book, with the wonderful capacity that the Quakers have for detachment, went through the elements of Northern Ireland society as they presented themselves: education, health, religion, leisure, political, the whole gamut of things as they were, on the basis of material that had been gathered by Barrett between 1959 and 1961. It was published in 1962. I was Irish Secretary of the Student Christian Movement at the time. It came on my desk. I took it to senior church people in Northern Ireland, and they could not face it. That book brought about a silence, incredible silence. But what it did was, we used it as the study basis for the work of the Student Christian Movement between 62 and 63. And for the first time, young Catholic students were felt free to come into what had been essentially a Protestant organization, to be listened to be heard, to be respected, and to go on to be continuing membership of it for as long as it existed. Now, I think I may have taken up nearly about 7 minutes, but it was a shocking experience for myself at that time. I've never said that publicly before, but to find oneself virtually rejected by many of those whom one had grown up to respect as holding strong ecumenical opinion and engaging in vigorous ecumenical practice, when confronted with what, in the most dispassionate way, Carter and Barrett presented in the book, The Northern Ireland Problem, they could not cope. And that left me, and has left me forever really, with questions about what the ecumenical movement, however it is, and wherever it is found, what it needs the capacity to embrace, to challenge, to create respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Salters. It's good that we have a second round. I'm looking forward already to how you will grapple with your own question. But it's certainly been a profound experience listening to it. So we'll move now to our next speaker, Bishop Trevor Williams. Trevor is Bishop Emeritus of Limerick and Kilolo and a former leader of the Corrymeela community. He was born in Dublin and ordained in the Diocese of Oxford, but spent most of his ordained life in Northern Ireland, where he worked for more than 30 years. Prior to being elected as Bishop of Limerick in 2008, Trevor was rector of Ballysillan and Ardoyne on North Belfast's Peace Line. He has also worked with BBC Northern Ireland from 1980 to 1988 in news, current affairs, and religious broadcasting. In 1993, Trevor was elected leader of the Corrymeela community, committed to reconciliation, and he was in that post for 10 years. And in that time, Corrymeela and ISE in partnership convened biennial conferences on the challenge of reconciliation to Christians and churches for those in ministry during the violent conflict, and co-sponsored the Faith and Politics Group, an interchurch cross-border group producing in partnership with others short publications on faith and politics, copies of which were sent to every political and church leader across the island. Trevor remains actively committed to interchurch and interfaith relations, community development, and communications. He retired as Bishop of Limerick and Kilolo in 2014, but I expect we'll see, Trevor, that you have not given up your post as a true ambassador of reconciliation. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Geraldine. And congratulations to the ISE on this 50 years marvelous work. Fantastic example to us all, really, who seek to find a way forward in terms of reconciliation, and such a resource in so many ways to us all. I suppose one of the things in approaching this subject, and this question about looking at the current ecumenical movement for reconciliation, I do it from the perspective of my twin perspectives of being, if you like, a church leader and also a member of the Corrymeela community. And I must say, what I came up with to share with you may sound very critical and very negative, but these are questions to myself. This is, I suppose, whenever I try to prepare a sermon or something, I need to find a challenge for me before I feel I have anything to pass on to anybody else. So these are words addressed to myself, first of all, as a member of the church. I'm not scapegoating anybody. These are me as church trying to tackle some of the questions which the subject that we're discussing today raises. I think we need to realize that the church is a fractured church and part of the problem of our broken world. And one of the things I feel is that the church that bears a message of good news is actually also meant to be, while recognizing it's part of the problem, also to be part of the solution. But certainly from the perspective of the institutional churches, repairing the damage of interchurch conflict in terms of its centuries of conflict with each other has been a primary focus of the ecumenical movement. It addressed and still needs to address the legacy of centuries of separate development, seeking to move from the demonization of the other at times towards a growing mutual appreciation of diversity and what we can learn from each other. And remarkable progress has been made in doing just that. One of the major developments in addressing interchurch relationships happened at times of great world change. So not necessarily initiated from the inner faith life of the church itself, but actually in the context of huge change that was happening in the world. The ecumenical movement among Protestant churches is traced back to the World Missionary Conference in 1910 that Salters has already talked about, where empire, I suppose, and the experience of empire opened up a global awareness, and that gave a new perspective for the church to do its thinking. The Second Vatican Council came about as a major shift in all of Western society in the 60s, and gave the context for reform within the church itself. In other words, it was when the churches focused on the needs of the world that they seemed to find the energy and the desire to work together. I hope to pick up this later. My own personal experience, and I realize it was an extremely privileged experience, was to grow up as a part of a tiny Protestant minority in a Catholic-dominated city of Dublin a very long time ago. But it did mean that my best friends were all Catholics. And peculiar as I may be, one of my favorite memories was discussing the differences between my faith, culture, and traditions with my best friend, Noel Larry, who was a Catholic. And I developed a love for the Catholic Church as a result. I realize now that that experience was not commonplace. I came to live in Northern Ireland, the last place I wanted to be, because I really felt that the attitudes between churches here was something I did not want to have anything to do with. But I couldn't resist the job of an offer of being an assistant chaplain in Queen's University, so I came anyway. The chaplains met regularly, and we decided that what we needed to augment our denominational programs was an interchaplaincy program to facilitate students who were meeting across the Protestant Catholic divide, many for the first time. Queen's chaplains could have been successfully institutionally while avoiding the challenge of reconciliation totally. They could have developed strong denominational organizations and neglected what I believe is the primary calling of the church, to be the agent of God's love in reconciliation of a divided world. It was at that time I discovered Carmela as a place where I could find support in this work, and I became a member, and I'm a member ever since. It was a raw time, 1977. Violence, suffering were all too commonplace. And I was indeed reporting part of news and current affairs at that time, reporting to a world how Christians were killing each other here in Northern Ireland. The fact that religious identity mirrored the two sides of the conflict gave a very complex and misunderstood but terrible picture of what the Christian faith stands for. That meant that the church's interchurch talks became crucially significant, showing another way forward, showing a way towards peace and reconciliation. However, there was fierce opposition to such initiatives, with Ian Paisley being perhaps one of the prime movers in such opposition. Again, these extreme times brought forward new ecumenical initiatives. A local level, courageous ecumenical communities sprang up, with many of them on the peace lines. The Curragh, the Cornerstone communities, the Columbanus community that Michael Hurley set up, for instance, to name but a few, focusing on reconciliation at the local level. And again, it was the agenda of reconciliation in the world that was the agenda, not necessarily just reconciliation in the church, but in responding to the need of reconciliation in the world, the churches and people from member churches, if you like, joined these ecumenical communities and actually contributed so much at a local level. And on a different level, the ISE and its adult education program and its teaching in terms of, and its academic teaching, laid a foundation for another way of thinking than had been breaking new ground, if you like, in terms of the context of church life. And Corrymeela focused on the theme of reconciliation in society and in the church, as Geraldine has mentioned. It's interesting that it's individuals, I believe, and not institutions that often bring about change. And if I might cite the example of ISE and Corrymeela, both movements for reconciliation were initiatives of individuals or groups and the groups they worked with, rather than the fruit of institutional church mission in the world. My experience of work in a parish in North Belfast and in diocesan structures has been that there is always the opportunity to work ecumenically. In fact, in North Belfast, it was important to meet regularly with all the clergy of the area across that interface in Ardoyne, and because it reminded us, what is it that we can be doing together? What is it practically that needs to be done? And can we do this together? Because we met, we were forced to face that agenda. I'm sure otherwise we would have planned our own programs and carried on in blessed isolation. There were, for parishioners, there was little resistance to those ecumenical events. But to be honest, I suppose, and I take responsibility for this because this is the way people are taught in church. To be honest, reconciliation was always a matter of second order importance. The primary work of a denomination is similar, I think, to any institution: self-preservation and survival, looking after our own. And I think that I say that quite bluntly and quite crudely, because I think it is something we need to address. Building a strong identity, building community, caring, serving one another, yes, but primarily within a denomination, it is for the sake of the denomination. While supporting Corrymeela, the institutional churches have always remained at arm's length. All institutions, it seems to me, don't commit fully to work they don't control. And there is always a sense that such lay movements and parachurch organizations, that no matter how much they may work for reconciliation, are in some way rivals and competitors. Church support for Corrymeela has been from individuals and church congregations in Britain and in Europe in the times past, in Germany, for instance, from church denominations as part of their outreach budget, but actually only passing comment and passing support, individually given, but not structurally encouraged. At present, church structures are under a greater challenge than ever before. This is a moment to pursue their ecumenical commitment in courageous ways, to do it together. Will they do so? I think it's highly unlikely. Meanwhile, the work of reconciliation, like the work for peace, has become a minority interest. At a time when learning to live with difference has never been more important in our world, when the fractures in society threaten stability, when peace is threatened because it is assumed, when reconciliation is the issue which needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed ecumenically. Churches need to see that reconciliation in society is a huge part of God's given mission. It needs to love the world sacrificially, as God does. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for your profound and pointed comments. So may I just check with Jen, has Linda been able to join us?
Yes, she's here.
Oh, good. And you've been able to tell her that we
Yes.
That's good. That's good. So moving on then, our next speaker is Damian Jackson. Damian is Programme Officer of the Irish Council of Churches and the Irish Interchurch Meeting. His work focuses on fostering local interchurch relations and resourcing those two national ecumenical bodies in their engagement on such urgent challenges as migration and asylum, climate justice, and the worsening crisis of housing insecurity and homelessness. Previous to taking up this role, Damian worked in the Irish School of Ecumenics on a Horizon 2020 funded project where he researched the ethics of technology use in disaster response. Following his MPhil in International Peace Studies, Damian did a PhD in ISE and investigated attitudes of Irish churchgoers to undocumented migrants. It remains an important source and it puts critical challenges and questions to church, state, and society. It remains an important source, and said that. Damian is also a trustee of the Dublin City Interfaith Forum. He lives in Dublin and is married to Diane with 3 teenage daughters. It's hard to believe they're teenagers, Damian. I remember them as tots at the time of your PhD graduation. So you're welcome, Damian. We'll look forward to what you want to say to us.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. Yeah, I can't believe they're teenagers either. Well, thank you very much, Jane, for inviting me to speak here. ISE is very, very special for me. It's played a big part in my life and in my work, and it's a real honor to be asked to speak amongst all these other much more informed people than me. But thank you. I'm going to focus more very practically, I suppose, on my current work and only on certain elements of that, just for time reasons. So I haven't got that wonderful perspective that Linda and Salters and Trevor have brought us, but it's I think it might illustrate some of what they'll be saying, and certainly what they're saying is a challenge to me. Trevor mentioned demonization there, and I think it's quite telling as to how much work has been done by ISE, by the Irish Council of Churches and Irish Interchurch Meeting over the last 100 or 50 years or 40 years, that, you know, this is not something that is a word, there's not a word that I would use to describe the perspective of all but a tiny few church leaders, you know, in Ireland. I would say that the challenges that we face now in our work, encouraging local interchurch engagement, don't have to do with that kind of a problem. I think the primary problem we have to challenge is probably apathy. We may have moved from demonization to apathy. It's non-controversial in most places to have a kind of cordial relationship with people from the other churches in your vicinity. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and I think the challenge probably is to wake up and encourage people to engage intentionally, to move beyond the current shallow easiness, I suppose, so that we're equipping people to think more profoundly about what the role of the churches in this particular place at this particular time is. It's challenging to broaden beyond those for whom ecumenism is their thing. So some, you know, leaders, they're happy to be involved with this, but if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. And, you know, part of the challenge of our work is to, when we meet people engaged in local interchurch work, is to encourage them to say, well, listen, who's not involved in this? And what churches are not able to be involved, and how can they be? Now, one of the problems with this is the word itself. Ecumenism is a loaded term and turns some people off straight away. So to be honest with you, it's not a word that I use in my work. I talk about interchurch work. And a difficulty is to begin these conversations with people for whom ecumenism is something with which they don't want to engage. And part of the reason for that is that it means different things to different people. For some people, it means common worship, joint worship, which is something that they would not feel that they would be able to engage in. However, for a lot of other people, it means anything that we do together as churches. And if somebody is therefore unwilling to become involved, they feel like they are being rejected rather than a specific activity that would not be possible. I don't know if that kind of makes sense. So, I've been working recently with Peter McDowell, who's just written a fantastic article that's going to be published in the Irish Theological Quarterly. And he puts a wonderful analysis on this, where he talks about, he outlines a methodology that the Irish Church's Peace Project developed kind of in action as to how to address this problem. So I'll encourage you to read that article. I can't really go into it now, but it's something that certainly we're going to be, well, we find ourselves doing it in practice quite a lot anyway, but to put this structure on it is very useful to help us to engage with those for whom ecumenism is not their thing, and to encourage those for whom it is their thing to look more profoundly at what they need to be doing together. Now, the other thing I want to look at is our work as the national ecumenical body. Our job, of course, is to bring the national church leaders of our member churches together to enable them to collaborate and work together. And again, I think it's telling us to how much work has been done, that the relations are really, really good, and the collaboration is sort of just assumed as natural between most of the church leaders, the national church leaders in Ireland. And I think the question that we're now asking is not how do we exclude one another? What are the barriers to our collaboration and our relations with one another? But what are the exclusionary theologies that we still find in our churches? Or how are the exclusionary practices in our society reflected within our churches? For we're not immune to them. The Community Relations Council, in its study of what the churches have done in 10 years since the Belfast Agreement in 1998, said the churches are often places of ordered calm, a safe space where we are among our own, where our enemies are outside. And I thought that was quite telling and quite damning. If that's where we are, then how are we going to become places of inclusion? And again, Peter in this article outlined the contrast sometimes between the espoused and the operant theologies of churches. We espouse being places of welcome and inclusion. But if you look, the evidence for this is shown perhaps, yes, in the people who are present in the building on a Sunday. There can be quite a diverse congregation in many churches, especially in urban areas across Ireland. But to what extent does that involvement go to? The parish-based integration project, which is a project closely connected with the Irish School of Ecumenics, had 10 aims, and the last of which was to see people, to see the leadership of churches, the diversity of the leadership reflect the diversity of the congregations. And that's the one that's been least realized, I would argue, which is quite telling. So this clash between espoused and operant theologies, and this process of beginning to look at what are the exclusionary theologies that still are there in our churches, whether they're there as operant theologies that we may not have articulated or be conscious of, and where they contrast with the espoused theologies are the challenges I think that we need to start looking at now in more detail in our national ecumenical conversations.
Thank you for those little conceptual frameworks you've offered us for thinking further about these issues. And so we now come to our final speaker in this first round, Dr. Simona Sin. Reverend Sin is Professor of Ecumenical Theology in the Bossy Ecumenical Institute in Geneva. Simona combines her teaching there with program executive responsibility in the World Council of Churches Faith and Order Commission. Previously, she was, for 5 years, Study Secretary of Public Theology and Interreligious Relations at the Lutheran World Federation, headquarters in Geneva. There she initiated and coordinated international study processes on church and religions in the public sphere. In collaboration with others, Siobhán has strengthened the interreligious dimension of the Church's humanitarian development and advocacy work. Her doctoral research at the University of Münster focused on contemporary challenges of religious pluralism, having also studied Protestant theology in Bethel, in Heidelberg, and Tübingen. Siobhán is an MPhil graduate in the Irish School of Ecumenics in Ecumenical Studies in ISE Dublin, and she's since been involved in ecumenical and interreligious networks regionally and internationally in all their richness and complexity of relationship. She's been a member of the steering committee of the Center for Christian-Muslim Encounter in the Deutscher Evangelischer Kirchentag, and is a member of the European Society for Intercultural Theology and Interreligious Studies and of Societas Ecumenica Europa. Siobhán, we're delighted that you've come to our shores this evening, and we look forward to hearing what you've to say to us from your focally ecumenical work in Geneva, but with an international community.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. It's really a joy for me to be part of this webinar this evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I congratulate the Irish School of Ecumenics to its 50th anniversary. This school is unique. It has a clear and sustained commitment to local ecumenical engagement, to fine academic teaching and research, and has always had strong links with the global ecumenical movement. And I'm personally very grateful for the way ISE has nurtured me, has nurtured my academic development as well as my ecumenical journey. Now, let me speak to the topic of this panel conversation, Ecumenical Movement and Reconciliation. The World Council of Churches has recently put reconciliation in very explicit terms on its agenda, with the theme for the next assembly. So this assembly will take place beginning of September 2022 in Karlsruhe, Germany. The theme, Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. So reconciliation is prominently identified as a key issue. Now, how will the WCC and all its members and partners explore this issue in preparation for the assembly? I would like to point out 3 trajectories that I see converging in the WCC's approach to reconciliation. First, reconciliation in the context of the WCC is clearly linked to the trajectory of the conciliar process of justice, peace, and integrity of creation. Then the decade to overcome violence, and since the Busan Assembly, the pilgrimage of justice and peace. So when the WCC speaks about reconciliation, the concept of just peace or peace with justice comes to mind. And this, of course, includes peace with the earth. In the pilgrimage of justice and peace, very concretely, there have been manifold pilgrim team visits in the last 7 years to different places around the world that needed the presence of such pilgrim teams. And what has been important in the approach and spirituality of these pilgrim team visits have been 3 dimensions. First, celebrating the gifts. Second, visiting the wounds, often wounds of violence. And thirdly, transforming injustice. And we hope that these basic dimensions of reconciliation processes will also inspire the understanding, the future understanding. So this was the first trajectory, coming out of the JPIC process. And yeah, the second trajectory that is present in the WCC's understanding of reconciliation is, of course, its close link to the theme of unity. And in the assembly theme, it's close together to reconciliation and unity. So this, of course, engages with the work of faith and order, and that quite slow, painstaking process of helping the churches to deepen their understanding of koinonia, of doing the ecclesiological work to build a common vision of the church. I think many of you will be familiar with the last ecclesiological statement of faith and order from 2013, the church towards a common vision. Now, we have received a good many responses, and we will actually soon publish the responses. And I just want to highlight one response, the one from the Roman Catholic Church. It came towards the end of 2019. It is 67 pages long, and it was developed in a quite unique process. And we in Faith and Order see the Roman Catholic response clearly as a sign of hope. The depth with which this response engages with the questions at stake is profound. Of course, you can also see that numerous voices have been part of the process. That's also visible, but that's perfectly fine. But we think that this is quite helpful for the not always easy work of Faith and Order. Furthermore, I want to mention in relation to Faith and Order that the current director, Odair Pedrosa Mateus, Reformed theologian from Brazil, is profoundly reflecting on the future of Faith and Order work in light of his own theological work, but also in light of his profound engagement with the WCC, of how can Faith and Order address more issues of the world, contemporary issues of church and society. And I mean, listening to those who spoke before me, I think this is in the air, and I just want to affirm that also from those in Faith and Order who are just here in the Secretariat. We feel the same need. Yeah. And the third trajectory with which that contributes to the WCC's understanding of reconciliation is found in the assembly theme itself. The theme begins with Christ's love. Now, the architects behind the theme clearly wanted to have a theme for the next assembly that has a strong theological and spiritual grounding. And the biblical reference that is given is 2 Corinthians 5, very classic. Of course, we had immediately people who were alert, actually fearing that the WCC would now fall back into a narrow Christocentric understanding of the ecumenical endeavor. How is it now that what do you actually want to say when you say Christ's love? And that immediate kind of concern that was raised was very helpful because it pushed the planning team to go deeper, to think more profoundly. And so the assembly theme paper that has been developed last year now clearly situates the reflection in Trinitarian theology. Moreover, it relates it to a profound understanding of incarnation. And it was not least Odair who clearly said you cannot understand Christ's love if you bypass Jesus's compassion. And that, for me, that's a key phrase. So Christ's love is, for many people, Christians and even beyond Christianity, the entry point to understanding Christ's love is Jesus's compassion and his profound engagement with the world. So I think that theme has potential. So just to bring the three trajectories together, the WCC proposes to continue the work of reconciliation, building on the strong advocacy work coming from the JPIC and Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, continue to work conceptually and theologically in the Faith and Order Commission, and continue to struggle with the particularity and universality of God's grace that's given to us. So far from my side.
Thank you, Simona. That's most encouraging to hear your analysis of the constant dialectic grappling of the WCC with its own agendas in dialogue with the world and with the diversity of its own members. So thank you. So we have come to the end of round one, and I'll just give you a moment to just reflect quietly on the contributions we've heard, and just to note for yourself if you've seen any patterns or heard resonances, one contribution with another, in symbol, thought, or in actual ways of phrasing the response to the questions. Maybe to note for yourself any surprises or any question that's formulating in your mind, because the chat box is open and you can even now be noting questions that can be gathered by Jin. So we're going to continue now to address the second question, which the panelists were asked to ponder. And Linda is once again our first speaker. But Linda, before you pick up on the second question, where you will offer perspectives on the questions and challenges that you have highlighted and posed, you'd only got as far as giving us one of them. So would you like to take the time that you lost owing to our technical difficulties?
Thank you, Geraldine, and apologies for that technical difficulty. I hope it, won't occur again. But so what I was, just to say, what I was talking about when I got cut off was really the first point being how the Ecumenical Movement for Reconciliation has really been really at the forefront of engaging with, political, economic and environmental crises through research, through academic work, through advocacy and through practice, and sort of this work of denunciation and critique. And so that's in a way the contribution. I was just about to say that the challenge in a way is the other side, which is really, I guess, the religious populism that can actually be, an anchor for extremism, for racism, for violence, and for hate. And so that was really where I wanted to end. That is that there is the sort of the ambiguity of religion and religious leaders being both voices of reconciliation and amplifying political extremism and hate. And in a way, part of the challenge for the movement for reconciliation is to work on that intersection as well. And then just to move on to the second question about how to overcome these challenges. Well, I was very interested in what Trevor and Damian were talking about in terms of how the demonization has really receded in a way in terms of those who are engaged in the ecumenical movement, but in a way the demonization has migrated to another group or set of individuals who are really, I suppose, amplifying this way of thinking about Christianity that closes rather than opens the message. And as I was thinking about, how to overcome this challenge, really, obviously, there are very many practical things, and there is a significant amount of work underway in terms of the practice of engaging with groups and individuals who have particular interpretations of the Christian tradition. But more fundamentally than that, I think we really need to think through how it is that at times of heightened vulnerability, the human instinct is often to go to tribalism, to hate, to exclusion. And some of the work that I've been doing and the thinking I've been doing, and also actually it's shared by one of the participants on the seminar, Jared Ryan, who's at the University of Toronto, who's also been doing work on how and whether the vulnerability and sort of a shared vulnerability, a vulnerability that all human beings share, can become a catalyst, not for extremism and exclusion and violence and hate, but actually a catalyst for a sort of an inclusive vision. So really, I think one of the big challenges or opportunities, I think, is to think through how experiences of loss and vulnerability can become the basis for a shared future. And it's really, I think, the way in which that can be done most convincingly and effectively, I suppose, is when we understand that we all share a vulnerability, that in a way human beings are, you know, essentially vulnerable subjects, physically, psychologically, you know, socially, etc. So what we share in a way is grounded in this vulnerability, our vulnerability to each other. It's tied to our embodiment, of course, to our dependency as subjects from infancy to old age. And it's also, I think, linked to the precariousness of the social institutions that we try to construct and maintain and reinforce and shore up. So I would agree with theorists and activists who are who believe and who have this conviction that we can speak about the we, because we've all lost, because we are all vulnerable, and the loss and the grief that arises from this is really the ground of our interdependency and our relationality. So as I think about this sort of way of thinking about what being human, then the question is, can the Ecumenical Movement for Reconciliation reorient political life through this experience of vulnerability? Can we disrupt the dominant political narratives that see vulnerability as the ground and the way of shoring up hate and violence? See vulnerability as something that actually connects us rather than divides us. Of course, I appreciate that it's important not to fetishize vulnerability. It's very easy to do that, or to ignore the power relations that are at play in many social and political contexts. But despite these challenges, I think it is important to challenge ourselves to ask whether there is a way as individuals and communities that we might think about take human vulnerability seriously, and therefore reconceive or re-engage with a different kind of politics, both within the churches and amongst faith communities, and also in the body politic more generally. There's much more that I could say about it, but I want to give the opportunity for conversation if possible. So that's the way I think about one of the fundamental ways of responding to the challenges that we have.
That's very helpful, Linda. Thank you. Maybe in the questions, somebody will pick that up and push it further, maybe in terms of the COVID opportunity. Thank you, Linda. So we move on. Salters, if speakers would like to limit themselves to 3 minutes, that would be good to open the window wider for the plenary. But if you can't do that without turning yourself inside out, stay with your time frame. But if you can foreshorten, it would be good.
Thank you, Geraldine. I'm quite happy to limit myself. I think I want to take up that vulnerability, though I hadn't used it as a signal, because for me, the great ecumenical question, whether conceived of as religious or just human, is in fact the whole issue of climate justice. I don't see any other question that comes close to embracing the whole world. I don't see any other question that comes close to being a judgment on humanity and within humanity. So I think we've got to try to wrestle with that, and we are all vulnerable. All our lifestyles are vulnerable. I work at the moment, work's the wrong name, of course, for anything I do, but I'm engaged at the moment with the Just Transition program, where it was decided to close down the Bord na Móna works in the Midlands 10 years in advance of the intention. So there has been no time to have a run in at what change needs to be made. And any group that I'm now in really is confronted with the most incredible lifestyle changes, whether it be in employment, whether it be in terms of energy use. I say to the ecumenical movement, will you be able to travel again with any conscience? Is the carbon footprint ever going to be possible? Or will human ingenuity find ways of travel that don't require the pollution of the earth? And so the ecumenical agenda for me relates back to what I said, and I'll finish at this point. I have two others, but I leave those for the time being. Here is a task. Simply doesn't confront the church denominationally or any other way as such. It is a human question. It is a human dilemma. It is a human condition. How are we to live and save the planet? I believe the church will contribute with many others if it is prepared to go the way of the vulnerable one. Yes, the compassion, certainly, but the vulnerability of Jesus, the Christ, stands at the heart of in whom and through whom all things have been reconciled. The whole creation groaneth.
So very clear articulation there of a challenge and an invitation and a fundamental option. So we'll move now to Trevor and how you'd respond to some of the challenges you raised and questions that need to be answered. And
thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Linda, for giving us that word and that whole approach. And I wonder whether one of the main contributions that we can make and suggestions we can make is for us all to consider that theme of vulnerability, because I think it is the human condition, it is the global condition, as Salters has reminded us, and which we can't avoid, and it is the Church's institutional position. Never have we been more vulnerable, never have been more criticized, never have been more marginalized in the Western world. So we are all vulnerable, and perhaps this is something we need to say, this is a good starting point. One of the things that we have learned in Carmila's work for reconciliation, which I find missing elsewhere sometimes, is that what we seek to do is to invite people to enter a safe space where they can share and hear one another's stories. As simple as that and as profound as that. It's in finding that space and having the courage to share who you really are with the other, that actually some amazing chemistry takes place, whereby connections of real loyalty and friendship and partnership emerge. The Church is known for its meetings, its abundance of meetings. But can I say the quality of those meetings often leaves a lot to be desired. In sense of, do we actually know who it is we're meeting with? Have we ever heard their story? I imagine this more relational view takes a huge amount of commitment, a huge amount of time, but I think we neglect it at our peril, because we grow and change and develop in relationship. And unless we are open about our relationship and prioritize how we are relating one to another, and what can we learn from the difference, as well as what we have in common, we are shortchanging our potential as human beings. I think it's not for nothing that Jesus says, where two or three are gathered, I'm in the midst. In other words, it's in the diversity and the mixture of accepting and knowing each other that actually we find the reality to which we all aspire. So I think the churches, for instance, need to be open to the world, to be courageous, to be secure in their identity, in fact that they are held within God's love, and therefore can expose themselves, if you like, to the reality of what they may hear, what they may learn about themselves and what needs to be done in terms of the agenda. We need to be also, when we're vulnerable, I think we know where we can find partnership. I think finding real partnerships within church structures, I think, is actually very difficult. And yet, I think it is the essence of what the ecumenical movement is all about, and what ecumenism has to be, and what obviously reconciliation is about. Can I say one hopeful sign I've received recently is the recent publication from the Christian Unity Pontificate in the Vatican, the Bishop and Christian Unity and Ecumenical Vademecum. And that is an amazing practical guidebook of things that churches can do and must do together, if you like. Really practical thing. Why don't you set up this, do this, have people looking after this? It's really practical, nuts and bolts stuff. And to have that coming out as a guidance for the bishops around the world, I think, as leaders of the church institution, I think is a really fantastic sign. I would commend that to everybody. But we need to look at, how do we listen? How do we invest the time that we have in our relationships? How do we commit to change? How do we make it safe where difference can be expressed? And how do we address the reality of that difference? One of the great examples I have recently is joining a group under the auspices of the Focolare movement, where bishops from across the world meet every year for friends of Focolare, if you like. And at the end of our meeting, where we discuss a theological theme, but we discuss it from the point of view of how we live it in our lives, rather than the academic correctness of the formulation. And at the end of that, and of the sharing of our lives together over a week, we make this commitment. United in the name of Jesus, we promise each other that for the whole of our life, we will strive in all things and above all things to love one another as Jesus loved us. Grant us, Father, the grace of your Spirit, that we may become one with each other, that we may consider the other's cross our own, that the joy of the other may become our joy, the yearning of the other our yearning, so that all may be one and the world may believe. And that dialogue between Christians, which we're called to in the first place, I think is also something that we need to extend to other faiths and indeed to the world. So it's not almost what we do, it's how we do it, to do it in love.
Thank you, Trevor. So we move forward then and turn to Damian.
Thank you, Geraldine. Well, I'm just looking at the notes that I prepared. They're kind of all connected with, I think we're seeing a kind of constellation of ideas that are related to one another. I started there by just asking, where are the exclusionary theologies? And the question is, if we want to address these challenges that we're seeing, we need to ask the right question. So, I suppose the fundamental question behind that is, well, why do we exclude in the first place? And it comes down to, fear and vulnerability and those kind of things. If we feel anxious about others, it heightens our sense of vulnerability. And how do we respond? And I found in my research the work of Susanna Snyder. She's an American theologian, very useful in this, and she traces two strands in the biblical in Scripture, which show that God's people have responded in two different ways to their own sense of vulnerability or their fears, and she terms them an ecology of faith and an ecology of fear, and both of those are present in the history of God's people. And it's up to us, I suppose, to determine, to go back to Geraldine's initial question, what kind of a church home do we want? Do we want one that lives out of an ecology of faith and an ecology of fear? And that's kind of what Trevor's getting at. If we have a strong identity rooted in our identity in Christ, then we can engage the other in confidence and in openness and in love without being afraid of them. So these are the kind of questions that we're trying to grapple with now. The interchurch meeting, I think, is going to be very interesting this year. The interchurch meeting is the annual meeting between the Irish Council of Churches, whose members are from the Catholic, Orthodox, and Orthodox traditions mainly, and the Catholic bishop representatives of the Catholic Bishops' Conference. It gathers about 100 people from all the main churches in Ireland and has a different theme every year. This year, the theme is on identity, and we're looking to, I think, complexify our sense of identity. Often we define it as in a singularity. I am an X. And that, by definition, is going to narrow your circle. But our identities are layered. And I think as Christians, we need to call one another to draw upon our deepest senses of identity, which gives us that security to reach out to others, because we know that our identity is fundamentally in Christ. Or at least, we can hope to live out of that identity. So, in terms of how to overcome challenges, I think, part of it's about asking the right questions and connecting these different things together and thinking about how that should impact our actual lives as church. What kind of a church home do we want? How can we make it a place where the belonging is not narrowly defined?
Thank you, Damian. One can't help but hear in that the resonance with the very word oikumene as the world home that we inhabit, and the vision of the ecumenical movement as relationships within that world home. So Simone, we come back to you and ask you to respond to your own questions or challenges that you identified, or ones that you've heard emerging from others.
Yes, let me start by also affirming the resonance that we heard in relation to the topic of vulnerability. First of all, from my own research that I did on religious pluralism in Indonesia, in the course of my research, which started in a very classic sense to discuss plurality and unity and how the many and the one relate, I realized that the many and the one is actually not the core problem. I realized the core problem is the feeling of being threatened, or in other words, of being vulnerable. So in the end, I said vulnerability and agency. This is what we need to talk about, not plurality and unity. So this is just to echo that. And I would really like to add agency. I mean, Linda is, of course, has been writing about this, but to see it as two. So because for those people who experience immediate vulnerability, it's so important to regain strength to be agents. Now, and what is important is to clearly link the existential questions that have been raised with the structural and systemic questions. And the ecumenical movement has for some time been strong on structural issues, on advocacy, and has not been so profound in terms of existential because the immediate advocacy needs were so clear. But I think it will, the pilgrimage of justice and peace and these pilgrim team visits have shown that we need to articulate the existential and the systemic more clearly in what we do. Now, concretely, I just want to connect it with the concrete work that the WCC does in relation to mission from the margins. These terms are contested, and I don't want to, it's not about the terms, but I think the marginality has been an important theme, and we need to link it to the theme of vulnerability because, yeah, that's one issue. And then I just want to mention that the WCC will have a new program executive on racism, just very concretely. I mean, you know, there is a convoluted history around the program to overcome racism in the WCC, and also churches back home in Germany have struggled with that. But at this point in time, WCC is very clear and that we need to continue work on racism, and it's connected to multifaceted or intersectional dimensions of discrimination. So its core is racism, but then connected to other forms of discrimination. So I see there is something emerging. Yeah, let me stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You've all been exemplary in self-limiting, good incarnational theology at work. So the remaining time is open. There has been a lovely sense of interaction even in this second round among the speakers. So I'm hoping that can continue. There are a number of questions have been coming in, or comments. The challenge is to hold vulnerability, resistance to oppression and violence, and solidarity in justice and compassion together. That's a comment. And another comment, the term wounded healer comes to mind. And another, many have noted the turn of the churches to the world. We should also note the turn of the world to the churches in and through the ecological emergency. The climate crisis is both a challenge and opportunity for the churches and the religions. So would any of the speakers wish to respond to that? They're not so much questions as comments, but that last one from Dermot Lane is inviting looking at it through the other side as an invitation and a new opening door. Would anyone like to come in on that? Salters, you had a fair amount to comment on climate justice and this being the issue, the ecumenical issue of our time.
Yes, I do want to come in because this allows me to bring in the kind of other hat that I wear, in which you mentioned. The most crucial issue for the people that I would relate to within the World Student Christian Federation, it has been for some years, and is, in terms of the program that they began to work with yesterday for the next 5 years, is certainly the issue of climate justice. It's what makes sense. That's obvious when we look at Greta Thunberg and the way it is spoken to those who are even younger than the ones that I would be relating to in the World Student Christian Federation. I think it is an opportunity because there is a grand narrative within our tradition of caring for the earth. We haven't been good at it. We have exploited it in many ways, but the groundwork for the grand narrative is there. And that needs to be worked on. I think of my own time as warden of an agricultural college, where we tried to hold the balance between wealth creation and the care of the earth. But I think we have to become extraordinarily imaginative. And I think the generations have to listen to each other in this one. And I think that there is no room for competition between any of the ecumenical agencies. I think handling what is involved in justice for the planet is going to require an ecumenical endeavor that brings us all together, and with people whom we never thought would be our partners.
Would anyone else like to come in on that?
Yes, Linda.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to just echo what Salters was saying, and also, I suppose, to develop it a little bit. I think Salters is right. The groundwork for that narrative is there, and I think what's particularly clear in the narrative is that the climate justice is not only about the earth and the biodiversity and the future generations, but it's also about justice and for those who are most affected by the effects of, you know, the lifestyles that we in, you know, the Western world, to use that phrase, have. So I think you know, when it's that sort of interconnectivity that I think is very you know, very clear, and whereas some other scientific or philosophical frameworks set up this sort of competition, you know, I think this sort of the integration of the justice and the care for the earth and the attention to those who are most experience most precariously the climate crisis. I think that's something that really can be developed, and you know, we see it in not only in terms of the theologies that are being developed, but also in a lot of the advocacy and, you know, activism that is, you know, think about you know, the long-standing advocacy in relation to the people of the Amazon, for example, and ensuring that their voices are heard as part of the response to the climate change. So climate justice is the term that captures best that sort of interdependency of obligations, I suppose, that we have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Linda. I see some more comments there echoing that in terms of the need to listen. Trevor and others referred earlier to the listening spaces where the most vulnerable stories are heard with respect, reverence, attentiveness. And so too, Nellie McLaughlin, hello Nellie, is talking about listening to the earth, the need to listen attentively to the earth. And I think of the World Council of Churches process on justice, peace and the integrity of creation, Simone, that you've called attention to as coming into prominence again. Among the most effective processes in that whole project was the listening to voices of Indigenous peoples, of Pacific Islanders, whose homes were already being overrun, flooded. And I mean, the signs were there and there was prophetic attention signaled. There was denunciation, there was solidarity, and there were movements of one of your, I think the third point you would have gone to, Linda, the idea of what action for transformation, the importance of praxis. On that, one comment has come in, and it may be worth noting for people who are anxious to maybe connect with a movement on this. It's the Climate Sunday project in preparation for COP26 in Glasgow. It's brought, at least in the UK, the broadest ever coalition of Christian churches and movements, which confirms the point that there is a readiness, a ripeness, an openness out of a sense of desperation, that it's the last chance saloon. So if anyone knows of congregations in Ireland who are affiliated into that, and I know Dermot Lane himself, there's an ongoing seminar reflecting on Laudato Si. There are other initiatives among some of the Irish churches and religious orders. I'm not sure, Damian, if the ICC and IICM have any initiative.
Thanks, Geraldine. Yeah, well, we do. We at our AGM, not last year, because we had to do that online, the previous year, we launched our affirmations on climate justice and care of creation. And that actually came out of a deliberative listening exercise that we undertook, which actually was supported by Jacob Erickson in the Irish School of Ecumenics, who gave us some of the grounding theological work to kind of do that. So in other words, the national church leaders have made a statement encouraging churches to commit to working out what they need to do on climate justice. The challenging thing about it is it's such an enormous thing. The question is always, what can I do about it? And so I'd just like to point to some of the praxis and the practical things that we can do. Eco-Congregation Ireland is an ecumenical initiative which has its genesis in the Irish School of Ecumenics as well. I would encourage people to go to their website, and it has very practical things that churches can do, local church congregations can do, and that's where it must begin. And I think Solters is absolutely right to say that this is an intergenerational thing, and that younger people are, very concerned about this, and challenge. For example, my kids challenge me all the time on the hypocrisies of our behavior and my generation. And I think that it's certainly something that local churches can work together on as a community, and there's very practical ways. So I'd suggest, irishchurches.org/climate is where the affirmations are, and Eco-Congregation Ireland, if you just Google that, you can find out very practical suggestions for that. Of course, Christian Aid and Trócaire do a huge amount of work of that as well, of NGOs connected with the Irish churches, amongst others.
There's thank you, Damian. Sheila Curran of Amory has drawn attention to the Amazonian Bishop Synod in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not sure if this is you've given the a link to it. I think if you have your chat box open, you'll see that link. I think it's probably the beloved Amazon, Querida Amazonia. There's some very powerful insights and challenges and denunciations, but also invitations that the time is now for acting. But Trevor, there's a question for you. You mentioned the importance of love. In the end, love is what remains, as we read in scriptures. What, in your opinion, is the biggest hindrance to building relationships rooted in love among the different denominations?
Yeah, we've touched on some of the themes already in terms of fear and a sense of not knowing who we are, first of all. It's interesting in scripture, you know, it says we love because we are first loved, if you like. And it's in love we learn how to love and actually have the strength to love. And in many people's lives, it isn't experience of being accepted for who you are. And churches have actually some of the blame for that in terms of preaching their morality above all else. They have actually very given the impression that they are inadequate, they are sinful, they are beyond the pale, they are of no worth, and so on. And in relation to mother and baby homes, recently we become all too aware of that very sad history. The churches need radically to readdress that, and to have that give that real sense that our love is a love which respects you because of who you are, a child born in the image of God, and that is your dignity, and no one can take that away from you. But in actually meeting together, we need to find that identity as ourselves, as Damian I think was saying, and then meet one another in that sense of openness, because we have found some rootedness in ourselves, for ourselves, given to us from that. I think we don't speak honestly enough about this. We don't speak, and when we meet, we don't really meet. Those are the issues we need to need to address. If I can just say one more thing very quickly, because I think it meets this. I was I heard Jim Wallace, the founder of the Sojourners community, speaking on the theme of living simply that others may simply live. This is in the 80s. That was the theme of that sort of decade. And I came up to him afterwards and said, I believe everything you said entirely. It's fantastic. And I doubt whether I will change as a result. And he says, it's not the principles you stand on, it's where you sit that matters. If your closest friend is dying of hunger, you won't have any problem to know what to do with the loose change in your pocket. Our problem is that we aren't close, we aren't open to others. That is our deficit. If we allow ourselves to be open to others, we will find a way of loving. And if we experience that and have that given to us, that openness, that others open themselves to us, we can actually respond in a similar way. I think that's the heart of the good news to me.
Anyone else? Damian, have you raised your hand? I can't see everybody on the screen. The chat box is blotting it out.
And Geraldine, sorry to interrupt. We have 5 minutes, and then in the third round we couldn't hear from Siobhán. So I think we hear from Siobhán and then conclude.
Simone?
I don't have any final word. This seems kind of odd. I think that I'm really grateful for this profound conversation. In the first round, it was mentioned. I think Bishop Trevor mentioned the word of pain and the broken world, and we turned it to vulnerabilities. And so I really feel that if we are at where the wounds are, actually this is where we find the both energy and direction of where to go in terms of ecumenical engagement, because it's, if we stand at these places, then we find energy and direction to move forward and to move forward together. So just from my side, because I'm also coming from the WCC, I really hope that as we move towards the WCC Assembly, this is not just an institutional event. This should be a moment where the ecumenical movement, both locally, regionally, and globally, finds a new vitality and really finds direction. And I think that's important. Ecumenism is not everything and anything. Ecumenism has a direction, and I think we have outlined this evening together. And so, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone. And there's just a comment from Sylvia reminding us that there are so many people of other faiths who are equally exercised by this. I recall back in the 1990s, we had a joint consultation with the Muslim community in Dublin on the theme of creation and ecological ethics and ecological challenges. It's unfortunate that there's been nothing since then, but there's an openness and a desperateness now. Jin, did you want to?
Yeah. Okay. I know that we have to finish, and just a quick note about the next webinar. So the next webinar will be on the centenary of the partition and a shared island on 25th of March at 5 p.m. featuring Johnston McMaster, Kate Turner, Lil O'Doherty, Mary Murphy, Duncan Morrow, chaired by Attain Tenham. So thank you.
So I think we've come to a close, and I want to extend our thanks to the 5 speakers particularly. So thank you, Linda, Salters, Trevor, Damian, and Simone. And thank you each and every one who have enrolled and participated and made your presence felt. Even though there's a huge loss in the lack of bodies intermingling, there's another way in which being able to see expressions on people's faces as we flick through the 6 pages does bring an immediacy and a vitality to everything. I think we're indebted to the Irish School of Ecumenics Trust for enabling this to happen. Thank you, Dermot, for your opening words, and Siobhán for your most encouraging and congratulatory message to ISE. I think we've all been challenged to a deeper listening, a deeper ecumenical engagement at the more profound levels of our own being and of our own relationships, and in the beyond this Ireland and beyond, the beyondness of our own comfort zones, the beyondness of our own particular denominational identifications, opening our minds and hearts and hands to those at the extremities of our world, of our churches, and of our diverse faith communities. We're all called to give an account of the hope that is within us. We struggle with words like reconciliation and ecumenism, but I think we're invited by the challenges of people that don't sit comfortably with those words to revisit them and see what it is that is actually proving an obstacle to that encounter and listening and sharing together. I think we've been given a strong cue in relation to the significance of the vulnerability that we're all experiencing in the precariousness of our world and its loss. There's been a challenge about the role of the churches, the role of faith communities, maybe in reaching deep again into our language of prophetic advocacy, of prophetic denunciation, refinding a language of lament and grieving and protest and resistance. and a language that is expressed in action and practice of compassion and justice for the most suffering in our world and for the suffering creation. So thank you one and all, and as Jen has already invited you, we look forward maybe to meeting again on the 25th of March. May God bless you all. Thank you.